Welcome, conversing listeners. What is the credibility of the faith in a time like this? The Rethinking Church Initiative is launching a new podcast called Credible Witness.
I'm Nikki Toyamasito, and this is Credible Witness, a collection of stories and wisdom from faithful people wrestling with and bearing witness to the credibility of Christian life today. Each episode is an invitation to listen generously and courageously to one person, navigating social tension and moral complexity, negotiating doubts, struggles, and fears, overcoming obstacles and pursuing justice, and living out the convictions of their faith. And every voice reminds us that the church is called to be a credible witness to Christ, a living reality of hope, justice, truth, and love.
It's a beautifully rendered collection of stories that reward a courageous and generous listening. So please check out our show notes for links to the Credible Witness podcast feed, as well as crediblewitness.us. I'm hoping that you'll subscribe today, and I believe you'll be deeply encouraged by the series of episodes to come. Thank you for listening courageously with me, and may God bless this new effort.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. I'm excited and honored today to have Justin Giboney as our guest on Conversing. Justin is the co-founder and president of the AND campaign. The AND campaign is a Christian organization focused on raising civic literacy, promoting civic pluralism, and equipping Christians to engage politics with the love and truth of Jesus Christ. He's an ordained minister, attorney, and political strategist. He's also his kids' football coach. Justin Giboney, welcome to Conversing. I'm so glad to have you back.
Glad to be here, Mark. Thanks for having me.
You know, it's been about 4.5 years since you were last on Conversing, and it's just extraordinary to think about all that has happened in that 4.5 year period, both
I didn't realize
in the national scene, the regional scene, the political scene, the medical scene. I mean, so many things have happened in that time. And I think for listeners who may not be acquainted with you or with the AND campaign, before we jump into your outstanding book, I wonder if you could just give us a sketch of a little bit about your background, how you came eventually to the development and founding with others of the AND campaign.
Yeah. So I am an attorney by trade. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and ran campaigns here for about a decade and worked for the mayor of Atlanta for a while as well. So a political strategist, but also an ordained minister. I'm also the co-founder of the AND campaign, which is a Christian civic organization that's trying to raise civic literacy among Christians and make sure that Christians have a biblical framework to engage with rather than just using kind of a partisan or ideological framework. We want Christians to focus on the compassion and conviction of Christ. You know, we looked out into the public landscape and we saw there were two sets of Christians that engaged. Either you were a justice Christian or you were a morality Christian. And we thought that those two were flawed, that if we look at the Bible, those things aren't separate, that they actually go together. And that's basically what the AND campaign is: social justice and moral order, love and truth, compassion and conviction. And so we put out a lot of content just trying to help Christians engage in a better way and give Christians on-ramps to actually engaging in politics, but also a lot of training and equipping people who either want to run, Christians who want to run for office, or just your everyday pastor who wants to talk about certain tough political or cultural issues in a better way.
Can you just illustrate that in maybe one or two different ways? What are specific efforts that you've done recently or are maybe even in the midst of doing?
Yeah. So for one, in order to kind of bring Christians together in the public square, we're starting here in Atlanta what we call Lit City, which is a childhood literacy initiative where we're getting Black churches, white churches, churches from, whose demographics are on both sides of probably the political aisle to come together for an issue that's nonpartisan, that's about helping our neighbor. But at the bottom of all of it is really Christian unity and coming across our divides to get things done. We also have our Christian programs for Christians who want to run for office or want to understand politics better. We have a 10-week program that we take them through to better understand politics, whether it be from a theological standpoint or just the X's and O's of a campaign. Mm-hmm. That's some of the training that we provide.
I think those examples and the definition of the AND campaign, the justification for the AND campaign, are deeply embedded in the book that we're going to turn to talk to. But I just think one of the things about the polarization that we face and that you are, I think, effectively and very deliberately seeking to counteract is this tendency toward a dialectical division that just constantly separates two things as opposed to holding two things together. And so much about the strength of this book has to do with the way that "and" itself is literally one of the operative words in the book and in the arguments that you're trying to lay out. The book that we're going to be discussing is the most recent one that's just been released, called "Don't Let Nobody Turn You Around: How the Black Church's Public Witness Leads Us Out of the Culture War." It's a great title and a great subtitle. What is the book about? Summarize it for us.
Yeah, I mean, one way to look at it is, how would the civil rights generation respond to this political moment, to the culture war and the polarization in this moment? What principles can we take from what they did that they would probably apply right now, and how much differently that would look to how many Christians are engaging today?
Right. It really is pretty breathtaking, I think, in the book to feel just the sheer number of voices and authoritative voices across really quite an array of geographies, locations, circumstances that you pull from, and that I think land in a zone that's very powerful and really strengthening to the whole argument that you're making. Just recently in the San Francisco Bay Area, Reverend Dr. J. Alfred Smith passed away, who was the pastor of Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland. And for 40 plus years, he was the pastor of a church that was very, very much an "and" church. And its work in the Bay Area and in Oakland in particular, with all of its incredible set of needs, has always landed in that space. And that kind of "and"ness continues. Just yesterday, I was in worship with them again. And again, it's just this sense of holding things together in a way that you are, I think, very, very helpfully and powerfully explaining in the book. I'm wondering if you could just talk about one of the themes that comes up again and again in the book, which is this phrase that you use, moral imagination, and the need for moral imagination, which is part of what allows us to be "and" people rather than either or people when it comes to holding on to both compassion and justice. Explain what moral imagination means in the book and why you think it's so important.
Yeah, sure. I think it's critical for this moment. So moral imagination is basically the ability to see not just what has been in the past, not what's going on in the present, or what's likely to be in the future. It's the ability to see what ought to be. And really, for a Christian, the ability to see what will be based on God's promises. And while this is valuable, is that it makes sure that we're not arrested by the moment. Any moment that we're in is going to emphasize certain things, and it's going to de-emphasize or hide certain things from us. And one thing that I saw in the civil rights generation is they were able to have a bigger perspective. Even in songs like "Keep Your Eyes on the Prize," that was a song about moral imagination. It was about seeing beyond this moment to know there's something bigger out there.
Right.
Because if I don't see past the moment, then when somebody insults me, I feel like it's all riding on what I have to say back or how I respond.
Right.
When that's not really the truth. There's more to it. And when I see that there's more to it, that allows me to be humble, that allows me to be charitable, and not just be worried about the scoreboard in this moment. And that doesn't mean that what's going on in the moment doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. But Christians always have to see the bigger picture and what God has for us as far as the victory that we know is already won.
Right, right. Justin, one of the things that stands out in your writing and in your leadership is a deeply formed biblical framework. And part of what you're trying to hold on to in referring back to that generation and also understanding the moment that we're in right now is allowing the scriptures to be a rich undergirding and formative text for everything that you're trying to argue for. Tell us about just your own developmental understanding of the nature of what is the Bible and why is it that the way that you use the Bible is so critical for the arguments that you're making? I think you do a very fine job of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was raised in the church. My grandfather was a civil rights era preacher, which I talk a little bit about in that book. And I was just always taught that the basis of what we do and how we act is based on the character of God and his design. And so that leaves us, some room within that framework to be ourselves and have our personality and apply it certain ways. But if I'm going to look at my neighbor and if I'm going to look at how the purpose of my life, it has to be based on my relationship with God. And I think that's very different than, probably what I was taught at Vanderbilt University or where some other folks who, went to institutions similar to that, where it's very it's very individualistic. What do I want? What I need?
Right.
And I just learned that differently. And I'll be honest with you, there were times when I fell out of that. But when I fell out and became more individualistic, I paid for it. And it made me realize to say, there's something to be, I think, to have and I talk about moral knowledge a lot too in the book.
Yes.
There's a moral knowledge to understanding that being tied to God's purpose is really where we're supposed to be, and understanding the authority of Scripture and being bound. I mean, that's where religion is. Being bound to that is not something that's limiting. And then, I wanted to get that through in the book too. It's not actually limiting. There's a liberation in, that being bound to God and all the things that, that he reveals to us.
Well, given how much individualism permeates American Christianity, especially perhaps white American Christianity, how does that work? How does being bound set us free? Just unpack that a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can I think we can overestimate how much kind of just doing our own thing and how freeing it is to really base our purpose and what we want just on our desires of the moment. I think that actually puts us in a place where we neglect some of the things that are actually important. In fact, other people and the freedom that comes through and the value that comes through serving other people, and in certain relationships, living for other people, sacrificing. Love from a Christian perspective, I think this is a perfect way to bring it up, is not just an affirmation or me, doing whatever I want to do. Love is self-sacrifice. It's being willing to, at my own expense in some instances, give up what I have to others. But there's a value in that and an emptiness, I think, in just doing what I want to do in the moment and what I feel in the moment. We don't necessarily see that emptiness initially, but with moral knowledge, with an understanding of God's design, we see an emptiness in just kind of following, just kind of pleasure seeking and following the things that I want to do. It's not always apparent immediately, but over time with wisdom, I think we begin to see that.
I think it's important actually that you're drawing out that point that it isn't always immediate and obvious, that love is actually this thing that requires something greater than simply our own self-interest. And I remember preaching on the Sunday before 9/11, and I had decided that fall that we were going to do a series in the church that I was serving at First Presbyterian Church of Berkeley on the first question of the Heidelberg Catechism, which is, what is your only comfort in life and in death? Mm-hmm. And it begins with the phrase that I belong in life and in death, not to myself, but to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. And it goes on from there. And I remember, there's probably nothing more controversial in Berkeley, California than to say that we don't belong to ourselves, that our lives actually belong to God, and that if they belong to God, then they belong to other people and to a community and to a world that we are actually meant to give ourselves to. That's a very, very countercultural message in many, many places, and certainly Berkeley, California would be one of those.
And it doesn't mean that self-expression is bad, right?
No.
Self-expression can be great. I do think it's a bad master. And I don't know that, especially in Western culture, we have necessarily figured that out yet.
Yes, that's a great turn of phrase. When you were talking about the civil rights generation, I want to come back to that for a moment and say that one of the most frequently repeated phrases in the book, I think probably dozens and dozens of times in the book, is a phrase that you use to capture the civil rights generation, which you capture in these words, Willie Faye and Mahalia's generation. Mm-hmm. Unpack each of those names and why you use them to describe this orientation that really is the and effort that you're describing.
Yeah, so Willie Faye is my maternal grandmother, and she was from Forest, Mississippi. She came up to Illinois in the Great Migration. And I think using her made it very personal. So yes, I wanted the reader to know this was a personal, like these are the people who reared me and these were their experiences. Mahalia Jackson was her favorite gospel singer. And so anybody who knew my grandmother knew she loved Mahalia Jackson. And interestingly, Mahalia Jackson was kind of like the voice of the civil rights movement. Right. The other reason that this works out is they were almost perfectly placed. My grandmother on the younger end of the civil rights generation, Mahalia on the older end. So they were almost perfectly placed to show that the range of ages and of this civil rights generation, which to me is not the beginning of the Black church's social action tradition, but it is the crown of it. I think they took some big steps and were such an example, not just to America, but to the world and how you engage in a faithful way, that I really wanted to recognize that generation and make it personal and kind of use my grandmother's and Mahalia Jackson's stories to really frame what this generation was about.
So let's zero in on each of those a bit more. So tell us more about your grandmother's story. You do in the book, but I'd like listeners to hear.
Yeah, so she grew up during Jim Crow in Forest, Mississippi. They worked on plantations, sharecropping, times they went without shoes, and saw an opportunity to move away from some of the harshness of the South to Decatur, Illinois, to be specific. And so her and her family, they make that move. Before she, leaves Mississippi, she has cousins that are basically run out of Mississippi based on false allegations. And so it was, the sad part is it was so bad they never really talked about it. So they didn't, it was hard to ask them a question about when they were in Mississippi and to get them to answer. It's just something they just did not want to talk about, but certainly the values that they learned. So, and here's the other interesting part. She was reared by some people who had been enslaved in the same way that I was reared by some of the people who had been a part of, Jim Crow and the civil rights movement.
Right. Wow.
So it helps people understand that these are a few generations separation. This isn't as long ago as some would have us believe.
Right. I think one of the surprising delights at the very end of the book is a picture of you in your grandmother's arms as a little boy, and the sense, especially because we've heard her name and her description through the book, and this refrain that keeps repeating, it's a shocking concretization of what you're saying, where suddenly you as a little boy are in the arms of this particular grandmother, given all of this story that you've been weaving together. Now, Mahalia, of course, is a name that is widely known and respected, but tell us a little bit more about why her story and the pairing of that with your grandmother is such a compliment. Tell us about those. Yeah,
so their stories parallel in a lot of ways. She's from the South as well. She's from New Orleans. And grows up in a really tough situation. I mean, she has some deformities. She's in a society that's very colorist, and she's dark-skinned. And so she's really, I think, on the opposite end of anything that you would call privilege. Mother dies early on. Father really isn't, around. She might see him around town sometimes. And so she ends up moving to Illinois as well, to Chicago, with her aunt, and sees how things are different there. And some things are better and different. But then at the same time, they both kind of encounter racism with a different flavor too. But we go through, different stages of how they were impacted by, how their generation was impacted by conservative ideology and some of the negative things there, but also impacted by some of the things that were going on with progressive ideology and eugenics and how that impacts both of them.
Right, right. There's a paragraph on page 175. I wonder if you could read it to us. I think it, in many ways, holds a lot of these themes that we're talking about already, but it distills it in one paragraph, I think, in a powerful way. If you could read that, and then we'll talk about it.
I'd be happy to. Christianity was in Africa decades before it arrived in Western Europe. And the African church fathers like Tertullian, Athanasius, Augustine, Origen fought for Christian orthodoxy amid an onslaught of heresies. Furthermore, as Dr. Esau McCauley explains in his book, Reading While Black, the Black church's social action tradition centered on Christ and the authority of Scripture. It was a living model of orthodoxy, right doctrine, and orthopraxy, right actions, unlike many conservative and progressive Christians today who either focus on piety or social action.
I think that paragraph distills both the longevity of the history of what the Black church from Africa and on has given the church. And in particular, it distills the division and the polarization between the progressive and more conservative side of the Christian movement in the United States and frankly around the world, but certainly within the United States. So I wonder if you could just talk a bit more about that dichotomy and why the holding together of those two things is actually at the backbone of what you refer to in the subtitle about the Black church's public witness leading us out of the culture wars. How does that paragraph distill what would help lead us out of the culture wars?
So one, I think one of the things I wanted to do with this book is dispel what I see as some historical revision. As it is, depending on where where you are and socially located, I think there's a false narrative that African American Christianity is, number one, was received just from kind of white evangelicals and followed them, wherever that led. But also there's another narrative that says it fits very nicely with progressivism, with ideological progressivism. And I wanted to dispel that. So as early as you see, those African fathers are about orthodoxy. Right. The civil rights movement was an orthodox movement based on the authority of Scripture. And I don't know that we're always honest about how orthodox and scriptural that movement was. And so I wanted to make sure that was very clear. Now, when you start, I talk a lot about the culture war. And when the culture war is happening, you see this split in white America between, progressives and conservatives. And the interesting thing about that is the Black church was watching that split. If you look in their publications, the denominational publications, they were watching what was happening in white America and deliberately said, no, we're not going to go on either of those sides. They didn't follow behind that. And one of the reasons that we find in some of the books I had to research is the feeling was, if we go to the right, we lose our bodies because there's just no compassion here, no concern for others. If we go to the left, we could lose our soul because they're not following the Scripture. Right. This was a deliberate decision that they made to say, we're not going to choose one of these two sides that these groups are creating for us. We have to do something very different. And when you look at how that theology was applied to the civil rights generation, right, you see the big difference. And so I think the beauty of this is not just theory that the AND campaign is talking about. This is proof of concept that there's not just two ways to do something.
Right, right. No, it is the power, and it is part of what's behind my sense for a long time that the hope of the American church turns in part very significantly on the witness of the Black church and this tension and refusal to separate what needs to be held together. Yeah. And I do think it's very, very powerful, and it is a third way that's really a different way than the way that we see in the polarization of politics. So much of the problem that we've discussed in other settings and on our podcasts is this dichotomization where things that should be really held together are not being held together, and it's part of what causes the church to lose its credibility. And its credibility, first and foremost, in view of what God believes the church is actually meant to be, but also its credibility in relationship to one another within the church. And then certainly the public credibility of the church has gone through a massive subversion. So I'm just curious if you could, you're aware perhaps that some friends of mine and I have started a podcast this summer that's called Credible Witness. And I'm just wondering if you could tell me what do you think it means for Christians to bear a credible witness today? What is a credible witness today?
Well, obviously, it means you have to be what you represent yourself to be. And I think within a very ideological society, it comes with understanding that our ideologies come with false narratives and idols.
Right.
And we have to be able to point those false narratives and idols out because other people see them, even if we don't want to admit it. So I think the key to a credible witness is, number one, self-examination. And self-examination within the culture war is like a no-no. Because if you examine yourself and actually do it publicly, then guess what? You might give the other team some points. You can't admit they got anything right, and you certainly can't give them an advantage. So we run away from this self-examination as if it helps us or if it really hides all the problems that everybody else sees us wearing on our sleeves. And then intellectual honesty, once you've done the self-examination, you have to be honest about it. And I think people, I don't know what the advantage we think is gained when we cover stuff up and don't take accountability. I think when we can be honest and say, you know what, we get this wrong, we have to do better. The honest brokers on the other side and in other communities, I think that's valuable. I think within the public square, credibility is currency. And so when we conflate things, when we exaggerate, when we cover things up, all we're doing is losing credibility. People see it, they know it. And so now when we come and try to correct them or try to make another statement, they know we're not honest brokers. And so we lose there.
Right. Going back to that phrase, moral imagination, what happens in a credible witness is that your moral imagination coheres, and it highlights both reasons for confidence and also reasons for humility and an ability to actually more honestly name the issues that are really underlying so many of the ideological assumptions that we carry because of our sociology or our race or whatever whatever it may be. I do think that part of what needs to be regained is not a newer and flashier campaign about the church. It's about the church becoming and living its identity. And if it lives its identity, then it becomes credible, not perfect. I think, it was Brenda Salter McNeil who wrote a book a number of years ago called A Credible Witness. And the thing that struck me about it is the liberty of not a perfect witness, not a witness without flaw, not a supernatural witness in the sense of being simply about God's own character being revealed, but actually a human witness that is credible and able to hold the tension of its both calling and vocation and its failures and disappointments, and to do all of that in a public way. I just think so much of what would change in the narrative of the American church is if the church really tried to do that. The beauty to me of Black worship and of Black congregations that I've been part of has been the depth to which these things are really held together. And again, yesterday at Allen Temple, it was the tension that was held together that made the service so powerful. And all of the raw reality of human need was part of the service, and so was this extraordinary sense of the power of God that is much greater than those particular realities. But it was holding on to both and not choosing one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'm curious if you were king of the forest and you could do one or two most important things to try to affect the credibility of the American church, what would you advise?
Wow, that's a big question. I think one of the major parts of the Black church's point of view, at least during that time, and let me say this too, I think this book isn't just an exaltation of the Black church. It's actually a challenge to the Black church,
Absolutely.
the white church, and just the church in general, right? Because I think there are ways where the Black church is even slipping or missing some of these things too.
Right.
I really think it's in the understanding that this is not a battle of good versus evil, clean battle versus good versus evil. Now, on any given issue, it could be very clear that one side is really wrong and really bad. That's not what I'm saying. But even in those situations, it's not just good versus evil. And when we look at it a little bit differently, it allows us to be honest with ourselves about our brokenness.
Yes.
Right. One of the culture war is so prideful that we just can't talk about our own brokenness and come to terms with it, at least publicly.
Right.
And if I could change anything about that, it would be to say, and I talked about it this way, we have this idea that somebody who disagrees with me on my biggest issue has nothing to contribute to if you disagree with me, Mark, on race, because I take that seriously, you have nothing you can contribute to my life.
Right.
And that's just wrong. I think we miss so much. Now, it doesn't mean it's not a big issue. It doesn't mean that I might not need to correct you. But one of the things I would change is how we see ourselves as wretches too.
Right.
Right. And I think that the civil rights, not only did they recognize that, they had disciplines to make sure that they considered that as they were moving through, and it was a part of their action. The other thing I would make a lot clearer, and I think this is a matter, especially for those who are social justice oriented, which I think we all should care, to understand that it's hard to have social justice without absolute truth. Because when you call somebody else to justice, you're calling them to an unconditional standard that they have to abide by, whether they agree with it or not, whether they understand it or not. They have to abide by it. That's only based on absolute truth. Otherwise, you can't force somebody who disagrees that is important. And I think this book hopefully speaks into the connection between absolute truth, human dignity, and justice. And I think once we recognize that in how we engage differently, and we don't try to separate the two from each other. So social justice and absolute truth go together. And when we disconnect those, we lose something, especially as Christians, that is just hard to fix.
What were some of those disciplines that you're referring to that the civil rights effort maintained to hold this intention?
Yeah, so one of them was self-purification. So before they would engage in social action, they would have to make sure through prayer, fellowship, that they were in the right mindset, that they weren't being bitter, that they weren't being vengeful, that they could actually engage in a constructive way. Now, Mark, if we all as Christians went through that self-purification process before we posted on social media, I think our public witness would be a lot more credible at this moment. But that's important, because I don't want to. The Bible says in Galatians that we are ambassadors of Christ as if he were speaking through us. If I take that seriously, then I do think before I post about, hey, is this something that's edifying, that adds, or am I just being bitter? Am I just, kind of lashing out? That's something to take seriously.
Right. So, Justin, one of the things about your own being, your own character formation, that's been impressive to me has been your capacity to exercise this kind of self-consciousness, self-critique, etc., that you just in that very illustration gave witness to. So where did that come from in you? How did that develop? Was that part of the influence of Willie Faye, or was that part of a development that came later in your life? I think a lot of Christians would want to say yes to what you're saying, but then pulling it off as consistently as, in my experience, you pursue doing is really a different matter.
I got to credit my mom with that. I'm thinking it probably came from Willie Faye, but Willie Faye had passed away before I think I had internalized it. One thing about my mother is she was always big on, if you're wrong, I don't care if you're my son or who you are, you're wrong. So if you do something that's wrong, the consideration about you being my son, I'm gonna still love you, but I'm not going to take up for you when you're wrong.
Right.
And I hate it. There's a point where I really dislike, like, you're my mom, you're supposed to go along with me. But I started to understand how big that was. And when people didn't do it, how ugly it made us. Right. To say we stood for something and then completely change if it happens to somebody close to us or they do something we don't like.
Right.
And that just really, it really stuck with me. Not something that I get perfectly, as I'm sure you know.
Right.
But something that stuck with me, that I aspire to to be honest with myself, say I got that wrong. And I think people, again, part of moral imagination is believing doing the right thing always ends up as profitable. It's always going to end up to your benefit in one way or another. And that's what I just try to believe. If I'm honest, if I mess up and I'm honest, in some way that'll help not only with credibility, but it glorifies God.
Right, right. Well, and I do think it underscores, again, the significance of community, not just community within family, although your illustration is a family-related one, but to be in an honest community of the fellowship of the church and beyond that has that same sort of set of practices, that feeling of reinforcing the significance of a communal effort as opposed to just the individual again, which is one of the things that's very, very different to me about worshiping at Black churches. And certainly, again, going back to the church I most attend these days, Ellen Temple, it's a church that truly does go out of its way to show honor. But in the showing of honor, it never fails to name also the things that threaten that honor, right?
Yeah.
So naming all the reasons why honor is due because in fact, a person's journey may not have always been at this particular place, or that this particular challenge, which everyone in the sanctuary may understand and feel is really intense, especially as it was yesterday in a service that was particularly honoring teenagers. It was really, really a moving thing. And the sermon was really about the complexity of being light and salt in the world, and how complex light is, that it's not just pure light and pure darkness. It's often this interaction, and what a teenager is grappling with is how to negotiate a world of light and dark, and in them and around them, and the distinctions between these things. What that represented so beautifully to me was a nurturing of wisdom in Job-like terms. How do you actually hold on to two conflicting things and not let go of either thing? And good. It was just, I think, very much what we've been talking about.
I'm glad you had that experience.
As a parent of three outstanding little men, which is how they strike me when I see your social media posts, not only are they athletes, but you feel your nurture, yours and your wife's nurture of them. How is all this applied for you right now in this season of parenting?
Wow, that's a good question. I try to think about all the time how what I learned from my grandmother can help me, help me raise them. And I think one of the things there's so many things that go into it, but one, if I were going to pick something out, it's a sort of resilience. I think today we've gotten into a sort of hypersensitivity where we almost kind of parade around in self-pity. And if somebody offends us, we want everybody to know, and we want, to get the most attention out of it that we can. I didn't see that from them. If someone were to say something today that's disparaging about us, I think we fall apart, or at least, get very performative about it. I don't think they had that luxury. I think if somebody said something ignorant, you said, man, that was really ignorant, right? I acknowledge, but I'm not going to I can't give you a whole bunch of energy I don't have.
Right.
I can't afford to give you all my energy based on that. And so they had the ability to say, I almost feel if you said something like that, that says more about you than me. I'm going to pray for you, but I'm not going to lose sleep over it. Right. And I do try to teach my sons, because people still say, racially insensitive stuff like that. No, you should confront it, but have the resilience and don't let it take too much from you. That's on them. That's an issue they have. Maybe it's an insecurity or whatever. I don't know. Pray for them and keep going. And I think today we can, and I don't want to take away from when people are really hurt, and it does, and that happens. I'm not taking from that, but I do think, especially there's some instances where we make a decision on the impact that something's going to have on us.
Right.
And I think that decision should reflect a resilience rather than some of the more, I think, hypersensitive or performative ways of viewing it. And they seem to have gotten that to some extent, to say, well, I'm not, that's on you. I'm going to confront you, but I'm going to move on. Right,
right. Your three little guys, emerging young men, are, I'm sure, different personalities. So in the course of that, how does applying what you've just said apply when naturally people's emotional lives are distinct and different and so forth. How do you parent through that distinction?
I mean, like you said, they're all different. And I think the resilience I was talking about is like a racial insensitivity. There's all sorts of stuff that as 11, 10, and 6, they're not as resilient as they should be. Right. So I don't want to paint the wrong picture, but yeah. I think knowing just getting to know them, knowing their attitudes, knowing their needs, and where they may need a little bit more of a pick-me-up, or may need more of instruction, or may just need to sit with things for a time. But really, regardless of what's going on, and this was Willie Faye, all knowing that they're loved, knowing that, you're going to get embraced, you're going to give dad a kiss, we love you. And so you kind of build up just a relationship that I think I'm thankful that I've had the time and the type of schedule that I can have that relationship with my sons, coach their football team. That's a blessing. And not everybody, has that sort of time or has the ability to do that. And so I don't take that for granted. And I also know, as you do, so much life ahead, so many decisions to make, so many mistakes to make. I'm just really proud of how hard they work and how much they love God. And, as they grow, and we'll take on all that stuff as it comes, but just really honored to be their father.
Right. I do think that what I'm trying to get at in a question like that, or those questions about family, is the full integration, I think, of what you're trying to do, Justin. And I'm here not trying to put you on the stand as though you're the pinnacle of something, because all of us know that we're on a long journey, and it has good seasons and bad seasons and good days and bad days. So I get that. But it is deeply encouraging to me to watch what I can get a glimpse into of your life, and this integration in the most public of spaces and in the most tense of issues, as well as in the most intimate family settings. And I think, again, credible witness emerges, I think, in the Black church when all of those things come together. And part of the beauty of showing honor, as happens in Black churches in a way that I think is really quite distinct, is realizing that it's against the backdrop of a culture that doesn't necessarily show honor to people who are Black. Yeah. But secondly, it's across all dimensions of life and all challenges and hopes and joys of life. And there's literally an integrated humanity that I find in a lot of Black churches that ends up sealing for me this credible witness theme that I think is the backbone of what you're arguing in the book, because the witness has been so powerfully integrated, and therefore there's less room to dichotomize and sort of squeak out from under something. It's all there. And I think the part of the power of what you're getting at in the civil rights movement was this integration of being in every direction, vertically, horizontally, across so many lines of division and disorientation and hatred, as well as places of potential justice, healing, progress, etc. And from our point of view as two Christians, that is the integrated heart of God, right? That's the nature of God's being. It's not as though God is about one sector of our life and not about some other sector of our life. So I guess I'm wondering, as you think about the work of the AND campaign and the witness really of this very powerful book, what is your hope, let's say, in the next 4 to 5 years? We had, in a way, quote, the racial summer, you might call it, and all of the racial reckoning, so much of which seems to have lost ground and energy because of all the political things that have gone on. Where does your hope and energy lie? I think the witness of the lit city is a great example of bringing things together, but speak a little more broadly about that.
Yeah, my hope is seeing God bring the church together across racial and partisan divides. The AND campaign will be 10 years old next year in 2026. And I wish I could say that the church has become less polarized. I don't think that it has. I think probably in the last 8 to 6 years it's become worse. So much so that if I bring up reconciliation in certain circles, it's like, man, you still talking about that? It's over. I have to believe that it's never over. I have to believe that part of the primary part of our mission is to bring folks together across that. And so I just want to see us reject the secular view of who can get along and who can't get along. We need to be the model of that. And in some ways, I think we've been discipled by, on one end, kind of like a Christian nationalism, on another end, an identitarianism that's pulling us apart. I don't think we get that we all have allies that probably don't want to see us come together, that might have an interest in us not coming together. And I want to knock the pride down. I want to knock the division down and say, hey, let's reckon with the past. Let's be honest about who we are and show people how powerful who we serve is by coming together. Yes. I think I would like people to see the AND campaign as an organization that's very focused on that. And I, even though society is not where we need to be, I think there are very few organizations that can go into a white evangelical space and have that credibility, also a Black church space and have that credibility. So God's still working, even though, we're not where we would want to be, or in some instances as a church, we've gone backwards.
So where does your moral imagination take you when you think about celebrating your 20th anniversary in the AND campaign?
I would love at that moment for there to be maybe 4 or 5 issues that the Bible-believing church came together that says, I don't care what party we're in, we're going to care about these issues and work together on these issues, regardless of what our parties have to say, of what our identity groups have to say. These are important to us. I'd love to see that.
And if you could choose the 4 or 5 things, what would they be?
I would say racial justice. The next would be family. Get into a space where I think justice and family are, for me, on par on importance of how much we need to focus on them, because justice is big, because justice can hurt families coming together. Right. But there will always be some injustice, and there's no better protection from that than a strong family. And so I do think those come together. Yeah. Sanctity of life is also a big one. And then poverty, to really address poverty. And I think that goes along with jobs, and, we can get into AI stuff and all that, but I'd like us to come together to deal with those type of things.
Yeah. Wow. It would be amazing if, in fact, such a vision was fulfilled. And certainly, I think what that does is that it concretizes in some of the greatest pain points in our culture and in the church's life and in society's life. And to see the church actually be a credible witness in the vortex of some of those primary crisis spaces, as opposed to where we are right now, where those things are the very things that divide the church rather than actually bring it together. That would be a remarkable revolution. And, we both know that throughout church history, there's been times when the church has performed far, far, far better than it has at other times. Never the fullness of the kingdom, of course, but far better. And may it be so that this is a time when that could be achieved far better. Any final word that you want to share with us as a challenge or a hope out of writing this book, and in your desire for how you hope it will land and change people?
Yeah, I would say that just keep in mind that the things that I point out in the Black church's public witness are a blessing for the whole church. They belong to the church as a whole. That is God working through us to show the world something very beautiful coming out of tough circumstances. And so I want people to feel, regardless of where you come from, what tradition you're in, I want you to feel that this is yours to take and build on, not just mine. I'm putting it out there. And there are other traditions where I think maybe books need to be written about how they add to, what Americans should be doing. But I did think the Black church, especially on the social, especially on how to deal with the conservative versus progressive false dichotomy, as you've been pointing out, had something very profound to tell us. But I want all Christians to take that as their own and build on that.
Amen. Justin, thank you so much for this time together and for the AND campaign and especially for Don't Let Nobody Turn You Around. I hope the book does really, really well.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.